Okay, I think Vicky already gave a pretty good introduction of what we do. I'll just tell you a little bit more before we kickstart our conversation. Peter and I got to know each other at Dropbox, where he came in through an acquisition and he was leading our machine learning team. He also had a PhD from Caltech, working on machine learning and computer vision. He's a true expert in this area. We actually worked together at Dropbox on an AI project. That's where we get to know each other really well. I spent most of my time working on corp dev there and doing acquisitions at Dropbox. So given our interest in AI and the future of work, which is basically what Dropbox focuses on, the topic of today is going to be focusing on how AI will change the way we work. So the first question to Peter is, how do you think AI is changing the way we work today?
All right, thanks for having me. So I think, AI, when I think about how AI is changing work, there's kind of two ways. Like, there is the obvious one, which is often on people's minds, which is through automation. People think about robots, people think about self-driving cars, and so on. And then there's the other area is kind of around, finding and processing information in various ways. So I think on the automation side, it's it's more and more of the repetitive tasks that we're doing in manufacturing or just generally, even for knowledge workers, where you often have to kind of move data from one place to another or process it in certain ways or summarizing it and so on. That's really where AI has been kind of enabling things for a long time, and is also going to continue enabling and changing the way people work, because obviously people kind of become more productive through that. I think the second one there is around, which people don't think about as much, is processing and helping people find information. Mm-hmm. It's one that if you're a journalist or a researcher at any company, you might spend your time a lot kind of just searching and Googling things on the internet and so on. And obviously that has been powered by AI for a long time. But it's kind of one of those things which is, while it's been happening for a long time, it's kind of accelerating. And if you think about it, in the past, this is where you would have employed an army of research assistants and so on, right, to help you find information. Yep. But now you can, a single person can do quite a lot. And I think as AI and these technologies like deep learning and so on can index and understand more data, there's going to be even more of that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's much easier to find information, organize information today with all the tools out there. So we've both been kind of knowledge workers, so to speak, which means we're sitting in the office most of the time. How do you think AI will change the way knowledge workers work? And what are the pain points that they have? What are some solutions that could make it easier, et cetera?
Yeah, it's kind of, I think, if you're a knowledge worker, if you spend your time in the office and so on, like you probably complain that you spend a lot of your time in meetings. It's just like that's what takes up most of your time, and in some cases that can be very productive. If you're a manager and so on, that might be a very good way of impacting the organization and making sure the right things are being done. But for most people in an organization, it's probably not very productive. So how can you get more time to spend on the things that where you can actually employ your expertise and actually get kind of productive, focused work done? So that's kind of one problem I think a lot of people as knowledge workers have. The other one is around which is getting more and more on the top of people's minds, is interruptions. It used to be the case that you had only emails. Now you're getting notified on Slack and all these other channels about things to do. Mm-hmm. And so that means that even in the time that you have where you're not in meetings, you're like constantly being interrupted and so on. So I think that there's kind of a lot of opportunities, right, around like just helping people focus their work more. Like one way I think about it is, if you're an executive today, most likely you might have an assistant that helps you plan your time and figure out kind of what you should be focusing on, shielding requests and so on, and basically making sure that you spend your time on the right engagements and get the work done. Just as we have made like kind of democratize or commoditize some of these things, like where in the past, if you were a lawyer, you had an assistant that wrote your things and typeset the documents you were writing and so on. Like then we got word processors, and all the lawyers could start doing that themselves. I feel like more and more kind of knowledge workers in general can get basically a shield to help them focus on the things they should be focusing. You know, like dealing with the torrent of requests that they're getting, planning their time for them, and so on. So I'm sure you've kind of seen also a lot of this as you've been talking to various companies.
Yeah, I have a secret AI assistant. Her name is Clara. She's an AI assistant that helps me schedule my meetings. I pretty much in meeting all day, probably 7 or 8 meetings every single day. It's a lot of work to even get the meetings on calendar. So this assistant of mine, she works 24/7. She never stops. She replies my emails, schedules my meetings. It's very efficient. I think the best part is that she's like super cheap. Usually when you hire an assistant for yourself, it costs probably somewhere between 60K to around 60K per year. She costs anywhere between $100 to $400 per month, and I pay $200 per month, which saves me a lot of time. I don't have to manage her emotions. That's one of the examples where AI can save me a lot of work, and I think people don't realize she's an AI. People are constantly very impressed by how hard my assistant works 24/7, even if they're in a different time zone. She's still like constantly out working. It worked out great.
Yeah, no, and it's pretty cool because if you think about it, like one big trend that is happening in the way we're talking to each other and communicating is that it's happening in a much more digital fashion with things like Slack and email and so on. And that means that there's like a treasure trove of data there to really understand like what you're doing and what you're spending your time on and what you think is important. Like the information in how you reply to people and what you like, which things you choose to reply to and so on, gives a lot of information about what you think is important. And I think we haven't seen so much yet about actually exploiting that to help you help automate some of these things that you might not feel like kind of repetitive work, but it's really like responding to kind of, oh, where should I find this? Like where do I find this document we talked about the other day? Or like what's our current, what's the revenue for last quarter and so on. Like these are things that we kind of ask each other because they're hard to find. But these are things that could be much, much easier. And I think this is one place where we're also now seeing a tremendous amount of improvements in speech recognition and natural language processing and so on, where it will be easier to make these kind of queries where you don't need to learn a new interface to find something. Like I think like where kind of voice and speech and so on is kind of one of the most natural interfaces where you can just ask ask something if it works and you get a reply back. Like we learned that from a very young age, right, and kind of cultivate it every day. So if we can make machines understand it, we kind of expose all this information that is in organizations, yeah, that can be kind of very powerful for knowledge workers. Yeah, I have Alexa and Google Home in my house, and even my son, he's 2 years old, he's learning how to use these machines. Although they don't respond to him, but right, I think growing up in this generation, he's using a very completely different interface from what we're familiar with. So, okay, there are a lot of tools that helps us improve our productivity for professionals. How much more efficient do you think people will actually get? Yeah, I think that's a good question. So there are all these studies about like what do people actually spend their time on, people say things like, it's about 50% of the time of an average knowledge worker is in meetings. If you're a manager, it's a bit more. If you're kind of lower down in the organizational hierarchy, most likely it's a little bit less in meetings. But it's like around 50%. So you can imagine, like, if we could make, say, meetings more efficient, maybe we would have a way of maybe improving the productivity of everybody 2x. But then there's all these other things, like I was talking about, like the interruptions and so on. Right. It's very hard to quantify the time you get to do focused work, and if you get interrupted, then maybe it's like some people say, like, if you get interrupted, you're not going to be able to focus for another 5 to 15 minutes. So that's really going to shoot down most of your day. So I think there's, it's not like we can make people kind of many orders of magnitude more productive probably for some time, but I feel like there's probably a 2 to 4x kind of improvement that we could do. Like, there's a lot of interesting things you could do. Like going back to, say, speech recognition, a lot of the interactions that are happening today in meetings are not being captured. Like, while you can search for emails, and there are these really good these experiments that companies have done. Like, I think it was Stripe that did this thing where every email is available to everybody else in the organization. So, like, you have full transparency in the communications that are happening. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, you don't really have to, you can reduce the number of meetings you need to have because you can find information. You can see what was being discussed in kind of email threads and so on. And imagine if you did the same thing for example, for meetings, where every meeting that you had with anybody else was being recorded and transcribed and summarized. These things, that was kind of really science fiction only 5 years ago. With the improvements we've seen in speech recognition, it's not so far away, especially when you can kind of focus it on the things that people are usually talking about in meetings. It sort of makes the domain of where things need to work a little bit narrower. Yeah. So if you could do that, then maybe you don't need to go to all meetings. You can just check in on what was actually being said on a meeting afterwards, even when nobody bothered to take notes, because maybe there was a microphone there and you have some assistant that listened in and just summarized it for you.
Yeah, well, I would love something like that. I think a lot of the knowledge workers, there are a lot of tools that will make our life a lot more efficient. I use Expensify and Dropbox, for example, the OCR that scan my receipts and automatically read the ports into readable format and can expense it directly. So I don't need to have someone to actually do that for me full time, which is like saving me a lot of time. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily care about improving efficiency. I think they're probably like so stressed out, they just want to get stuff done. And if you're used to Windows 7, even though the later versions of Windows is much more efficient, you probably don't want to switch, and because it's just much more cost for you to learn how to use it. I think there are more factors that make some people less efficient than others, but I think a lot of people, if they want to be a lot more efficient, there are a lot of tools that can help them.
Yep.
So okay, let's talk about robotics. Could you tell us a little bit about what you work on OpenAI on robotics? That's such a cool topic, so I'm sure a lot of people want to hear about it.
Yeah, sure. So OpenAI generally is a research organization that basically focuses on making sure we get general artificial intelligence arriving in a safe manner and to be beneficial for humanity. And part of the effort that we're doing there is on robotics. And one of the reasons is kind of like our society is very kind of adapted to kind of physical humans, and understanding kind of a big part of intelligence is very likely with how we interact with each other and the environment and so on. And so robotics is a big part of building a kind of a general artificial intelligence. And so what we focus on doing is trying to see how do you build robots that learn just like humans do. It's kind of interesting, you see robots today fall into a few different categories. Like there's the manufacturing robots that everybody sees in the factories and so on. There's now a lot of research and also commercialization going on around self-driving cars and self-driving things like self-flying drones and so on, like transportation basically. And then there's agriculture that people know a little bit less about, but it's a domain that has been automated for quite a bit. Like there are self-driving tractors and stuff like that. Yep. And then there's kind of consumer robotics where things are not happening very much because it's pretty hardware needs to be pretty cheap, and there needs to be kind of good application areas. But in manufacturing, where robotics is used the most, it's robots are incredibly stupid. They basically, all they know is how to move an object from point A to point B, and maybe do like welding along some pre-programmed trajectory and so on. It's there's very little intelligence and like awareness of their surroundings. So if you have a robot that kind of lifts up a part of say building an airplane or something, and then puts it into some slot. If you remove the object, the robot will just continue as nothing happened. It doesn't understand that something changed in the scene. A lot of the progress has been happening probably more kind of on the consumer side over the past 5 years or so in deep learning, hasn't really transferred into robotics. And so there's a big opportunity there for understanding, how do you make robots that actually learn, that can have much more, can generalize to a lot of different tasks. And so one of the things, and this, it's not only useful for manufacturing, but also for things like actually eventually building personal robots that help out in people's homes, helps out with as kind of our population ages and so on, helps just being kind of assistance to people. And so what we have been focusing a lot on OpenAI so far is kind of building robots that can learn from imitation. So, for example, the way we humans learn is very much through imitation. Like if I want to teach you how to swim, I'm not going to tell you, go into the water, move your, put your arms out, right, and then move them in this, by pulling them forward. It's kind of hard. How do I describe how you should swim? Well, the way I do it as a human is I just go and do it. I show you how to do it. So what we're trying to do is kind of building robots that can do the same things, like can basically learn from having humans show them things. So we have published some results on that already, where they're relatively simple tasks. But the idea is to apply a lot of what we have learned in applying deep learning to areas like computer vision and speech recognition and so on, and see if we can apply it to actually controlling robots. And it turns out to be pretty difficult, because robots has a lot of degrees of freedom. They can have arms with a lot of links and so on. It's much harder in some way, like building in some aspects than building say a self-driving car. My finger has as many degrees of freedom as a self-driving car has. And then I have a whole body, So there's like so much more to control and to work together. And the only way to really do that is through learning. So that's what we're focusing on.
Gotcha. That's very cool. So instead of, here's a question. Instead of, showing what the robot what to do and get robot learn, can we just throw a robot in the swimming pool and get it figured out on its own? AlphaGo is a kind of black box. Mm-hmm. It's kind of figuring out, we don't know what it's doing. How far are we from there?
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. I mean, if you look at AlphaGo, the way it really has become immensely good at Go is by playing itself. Like it's like basically you put two AlphaGo computers against each other, and then they keep on learning from each other, and they keep on sharing the experience and get better and better and better. So in some ways, like it's a piece of software that just learns from self-exploration. Right. And it's very likely that you can do the same thing. That's a really good way of like having robots to learn. I think there has been a lot of research in that, and I think that it's something that in many ways that's kind of a holy grail to, you just give a robot a brain, and then it figures out all its body parts and how to move them and how to do things. In the short term, it's kind of tricky, because robots do can do pretty crazy things. Like, they move their arm and, slap themselves in the face, and then they destroyed all the sensors just from like having some exploration. Like, it's just like, it's very hard to program a robot to explore the world in a safe manner. And then don't even ask me about like putting it close to people. Like, then it's like, then it becomes dangerous if it's like a 200-pound robot. So doing that with physical robots is pretty difficult. One way that has really kind of gained momentum in the past few years is training robots in simulation, where it's like very easy to reset environments, to rebuild new environments, and change the tasks and so on. And so that is one area where I think we kind of where we're starting to explore these things, like having robots actually just try things out thousands of times, and then the challenge becomes like, once you've learned that in simulation, how do you actually transfer it onto the real robot? How much of the real world can you capture in a simulation?
Yeah.
And I mean, I would say like so far, a lot of simulators have been very much optimized for being realistic enough that you can make a cool video game or like a computer game where you can run around and shoot things and jump around and so on. But they're not really physically accurate, and that's where a lot of the challenges come in. Like, sure, you can have a robot move around, but as soon as it starts interacting with the world, you need a pretty good, realistic physical model for it to learn something that's useful to actually apply on a physical robot.
Makes sense. So it looks like we have probably 1 minute left. The last question I think a lot of people in the audience probably care about is, when will they be replaced by robots, and what can they do to prevent them from being replaced by robots?
Well, for me, like one thing one thing that makes me really excited to work on this in general is I feel like there's a lot of things that will change as we get more robots and so on, and they're going to change in ways we can't even. It's going to be really hard to predict even. Like, if you have robots doing a lot of things for humans, then there's going to be new roles for humans, controlling and making decisions of what these robots should be working on and so on. I also feel like like a big thing out of this is, just what it has the potential of really making it, giving us much more time to do other things than like to actually focus on what we are good at as humans, which is dealing with a lot of ambiguity and reasoning and making decisions and being creative and so on, and all the things that we can do, but most people find pretty boring. All the repetitive stuff will be done by robots. That kind of frees up us to do much more of these things. So I kind of feel like that's a pretty exciting future where everybody can be more creative and just build more things, thanks to having kind of robots doing most of the hard work for us. Yeah.
Also, I think as technology develop, although some jobs will be replaced, some of the repetitive work that, as you were saying, more jobs will be created. For example, social media manager, this role didn't exist maybe several years ago, but this is actually a real job today. It's actually really hard to manage Twitter. I don't use Twitter. Every time I go on Twitter, I find overwhelming. I wish someone can do that for me. So like you were talking about earlier, about someone actually manage all the robots. So these roles will be newly created. So I'm very much looking forward to the future where we get to do what's more interesting, more fun, more emotional, more cognitively challenging than the repetitive work. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter.